It was the summer of 1982 in Bakersfield, California. A year that felt simpler, safer, slower. People left their doors unlocked. Kids played outside until the streetlights came on. And road trips, those classic family adventures filled with cassette tapes, fast food, and roadside stops, were a treasured part of American life. The Walker family, Ron, Diane, and their only son, Timmy, were taking one such trip that July. They'd been on the road all day, heading from Sacramento to San Diego to visit relatives. The plan was to stop halfway, get some rest, and hit the highway again early the next morning. By the time they reached the outskirts of Bakersfield, the sun had dipped low, and the sky was painted in warm orange streaks. They pulled into a modest roadside motel, the Maple Inn. A place with a faded neon sign, creaky staircases, and the lingering scent of old carpet and tobacco. Nothing glamorous, but nothing suspicious either. They checked in around 6:45 p.m. The front desk clerk, a tired-looking man in his 60s, handed them the key to room 12. Diane remembered commenting on the floral wallpaper. Ron joked about the old TV set, and Timmy excitedly claimed the bed closest to the window, the one with a view of the parking lot and a blinking motel sign just outside. The evening was ordinary, uneventful, even comforting in its routine. Diane ordered burgers and fries from a nearby diner. They ate while sitting cross-legged on the bed, laughing at silly cartoons playing on the small television. Timmy, full and happy, fell asleep by 9 p.m. with his favorite stuffed dog tucked under one arm and his other hand curled near his face, as he always did when he was relaxed. Ron turned off the light. Diane cracked the bathroom door open just enough for a sliver of light to glow softly across the room. Everything was quiet. But when they awoke the next morning, their world was shattered. Timmy was gone. At first, they assumed he might have gone to the bathroom. Diane checked. Empty. Then Ron thought he might have gone outside to look at the vending machine near the lobby. But the door was still locked from the inside. The chain was still in place. The window, though close to the bed, showed no signs of being tampered with. No broken glass. No fingerprints. No smudges. Just that blinking neon light and the parking lot below. His shoes were still by the bed, perfectly lined up the way Diane had placed them. His little red backpack sat untouched in the corner. The stuffed dog he never slept without was still on the pillow, alone. Panic took over. Ron ran down to the front desk. Diane tore through the motel room, calling her son's name, checking under the bed, the closet, even the bathroom cabinets, anywhere a child might hide. But it wasn't hiding. It was something else. The motel staff called the local police, who arrived within minutes. Questions were asked, the room was photographed, and witnesses were interviewed. But there was nothing. No sounds, no alarms, no security footage. The Maple Inn was old. Its camera system hadn't worked in years, and there was only one night clerk on duty, who claimed he saw no one unusual. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no tire tracks that didn't belong. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. It was like Timmy had evaporated into thin air. Within 48 hours, the FBI was brought in. Child abduction protocols were initiated, and agents began scouring the area. Flyers were printed. Canine units were dispatched. Nearby businesses were questioned. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning orchards, empty fields, and drainage canals. A reward was posted. Timmy's face, brown hair, bright smile, missing front tooth, appeared on every news channel across California. His parents appeared in front of flashing cameras, tearfully pleading for their son's safe return. "He's only 8. He's scared of the dark," Diane sobbed on one local broadcast. "Please bring my baby home." But the days passed, then weeks, and still nothing. The Maple Inn became the center of a media circus. Curious travelers booked rooms, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous Room 12. Some whispered theories about kidnappers using secret tunnels or rooftop access. Others believed it was an inside job. The FBI investigated everyone, from the motel staff to the delivery driver who brought their food the night Timmy disappeared. But no one was arrested. No leads ever turned solid. Eventually, the media faded away. Other headlines took over, but the pain didn't fade for the Walkers. Every birthday passed without candles. Every holiday table had one chair too many. In 1984, 2 years later, the case was officially classified as cold. And yet Diane never gave up. She kept Timmy's room untouched. His favorite comic books were stacked neatly on his nightstand. His calendar still read July 1982. Ron, once the more grounded of the two, slowly unraveled. Quitting his job, withdrawing from friends, growing distant even from Diane. The loss took everything. For the next 3 decades, their lives remained in emotional limbo, trapped in that motel room, in that one night they could never forget. It was only 34 years later that the truth began to surface, and it would change everything the world thought it knew about that summer night. The case exploded into headlines faster than anyone in Bakersfield could have imagined. Boy vanishes from motel without a trace became the leading story across California. News vans lined the streets outside the Maple Inn. Reporters questioned guests, knocked on doors, and thrust microphones at anyone who might have seen anything at all. Camera crews filmed from across the street, zooming in on Room 12's window as though the lens might reveal a hidden clue. Inside the police department, pressure mounted by the hour. Local officers found themselves overwhelmed by national media and FBI directives. They canvassed the entire area, door to door, block by block. Helicopters hovered overhead. Volunteers gathered at local churches, passing out flyers and searching empty lots, drainage canals, old sheds, and even dumpsters. There wasn't a field or orchard within 5 miles that didn't get combed through by search teams or dogs. But no one could explain it. There was no broken lock, no signs of forced entry, no muddy footprints, no scratches on the window frame, not a single fiber or fingerprint that didn't already belong to the family. Even the carpet, stained and worn from years of foot traffic, offered no clue. It was as if the room had swallowed the boy whole and then sealed itself up again. Still, authorities clung to the only irregularity in the motel's otherwise uneventful guest log. 3 doors down from the Walkers in room 15, a man had checked in late that same evening, just after 10:30 p.m. Nothing about him stood out at first. He'd paid in cash, gave a name no one remembered, and declined housekeeping for the next day. He had no luggage, just a small duffel bag. The clerk said he wore a dark baseball cap and kept his collar up high. But the thing that stuck out, etched into memory, was the limp. The front desk clerk remembered it clearly. The man walked with a heavy drag on his right side, as if one leg didn't quite keep pace with the other. That same man checked out before sunrise. No ID was taken. No plates were noted. Motel policy didn't require them at the time. He left the room key on the counter and disappeared. The room, when cleaned later that day, showed no signs of anything suspicious. The bed was untouched. The wastebasket was empty. Nothing was left behind. But police were convinced this anonymous man was the missing link. Every motel in the region was checked for someone matching his description. Local hospitals were contacted to find out if someone with a limp had recently sought care. But it was like chasing a shadow. He vanished as cleanly as Timmy had. There were no fingerprints, no receipts, no physical trail. Investigators were left with little more than a vague description and a growing sense of helplessness. Despite this frustrating dead end, the Bakersfield Police Department and the FBI kept the search alive for weeks. More than a dozen agents were assigned to the case full-time. Timmy's picture, his missing tooth, that crooked smile, was printed on posters, milk cartons, bus stops. Candlelight vigils were held outside the motel. Parents began locking their doors tighter, sleeping lighter, and keeping a closer eye on their children. But months passed. Leads dried up. The man with the limp became more of a legend than a suspect. Rumors spread that he was a drifter, a former inmate, maybe a trucker who moved from town to town. But none of it could be proven. The public began speculating wildly. Some blamed motel staff, others claimed cult activity. Even alien abduction made its way into tabloids. Meanwhile, back in Sacramento, the Walkers were living through their own private kind of hell. Ron returned to work at first, but he couldn't concentrate. Every phone call made his heart race. Every news report reopened the wound. Diane, once a vibrant and social woman, withdrew entirely. She stopped going to church, stopped answering the phone. The curtains stayed drawn at their house. Timmy's room remained untouched. The seasons changed, but time didn't seem to move forward for them. It just circled around that motel room, replaying the same nightmare every night. On what would have been Timmy's 9th birthday, Diane baked a cake and placed a candle on it. Just one. She didn't sing. She just sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flame until it flickered out on its own. Ron started drinking more. He stopped shaving. Eventually, the strain was too much for their marriage. In 1987, 5 years after Timmy disappeared, they divorced quietly. No lawyers, no court drama, just mutual grief that had finally split in two. Diane moved in with her sister in Oregon. Ron stayed in Sacramento, living alone in the same house. Neither remarried. Neither stopped wondering what happened. And still, no new leads emerged. Every few years, a detective would reopen the file, look through the photos, re-interview someone. But there was never anything new. The man with the limp remained the phantom no one could catch. The Maple Inn eventually closed down, then reopened under a new name. Room 12 was renovated. The wallpaper changed, but the memory lingered. To the world, Timmy Walker became just another cold case, another name on a dusty file. But to his parents, he was never gone. They believed, no, they knew. Something had happened in that motel that night. Something someone knew and hadn't told. And they waited year after year for the phone call that might change everything. It would take 34 years for that call to come. And when it did, it would stun the entire nation. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, the case of Timmy Walker faded from headlines. But not from the hearts of those who remembered. For years after his disappearance, the Bakersfield Police Department continued to receive tips. Some hopeful, most heartbreaking. There were occasional phone calls from people who believed they'd seen a boy resembling Timmy. Sometimes at a mall, sometimes on a playground, once even on a bus headed to Portland. One woman swore she saw a child matching his photo at a highway rest stop in northern Oregon in 1995. She said he was with a man who looked off, unkempt, with a stiff gait and cautious eyes. Police followed up on the lead, scoured surveillance footage, and canvassed the area. Nothing. In Arizona, a man in his late 30s showed up at a small police station claiming he was Timmy Walker. He knew the name. He even had a scar on his chin, just like Timmy had as a kid. For a moment, hearts skipped. Journalists held their breath. But DNA testing told a different story. He wasn't Timmy. He was someone else entirely. A man suffering from untreated schizophrenia who had pieced together his identity from newspaper clippings and missing posters. Then came the envelope. In 2004, a plain manila envelope with no return address arrived at the Bakersfield Police Department. Inside was a blurry photograph. It showed a young boy, maybe 10 or 11, sitting alone on a bench outside what looked like a medical clinic. His clothes were worn, his eyes wide and tired. There was a faded birthmark on his left cheek, The same place Timmy's had been. No note. No fingerprints. Just the photo. Detectives released it to the public, hoping someone might recognize the child or the location. Tips poured in. People swore they knew that bench. Some said it looked like a place outside a rehab center in Utah. Others claimed it was from a shelter in Idaho. None of them checked out. The photo was too grainy. No timestamp, no metadata. It was a phantom clue that haunted the investigators for years. Still, these moments kept the case alive, barely. By 2010, only a handful of people still spoke about Timmy's disappearance with any sense of urgency. The lead FBI investigator had retired. The motel where Timmy vanished had been demolished and replaced with a gas station. The street had changed. The neighbors had changed. Even the Walkers, now elderly and living apart, had stopped giving interviews. They still lit a candle every June 11th, Timmy's birthday, but the media had long stopped covering it. To most people, it was just another tragic case in California's cold case files. But not to everyone. In the background, one junior detective in Bakersfield, Elena Ruiz, had quietly kept the file close. She hadn't even been born when Timmy vanished. But as a child, she remembered her mother pointing to the milk carton at breakfast and saying, "That's someone's little boy." Something about it stuck with her. Years later, when she joined the force and was handed access to archives, she pulled Timmy's file out and read every page. Every statement. Every theory. Every dashed hope. She didn't let it go. And in 2016, that obsession paid off. It started with a missing persons database, one that had recently begun incorporating advanced facial recognition software. A private firm was testing it by uploading photos of unidentified minors from shelters, hospitals, and foster programs over the last several decades. One scan, just one, flagged a match. A man in his late 30s, now living in northern Utah, had been adopted under sealed records in the late 80s. He'd gone by the name Jacob Fields his entire adult life. He had no memory of his childhood before age 6. He always thought he'd been abandoned. His adoptive parents told him they'd found him through a private agency. No questions asked. He had a vague, unshakable fear of motels, but he never knew why. The facial recognition software, trained on the grainy 2004 photograph and enhanced versions of Timmy's childhood portraits, flagged a 96% match. Detective Ruiz got the notification. She flew to Utah the same week. When she met Jacob Fields, she felt the weight of decades press into that one moment. His face, older, rougher, still had Timmy's eyes, the scar on his chin. And when she showed him a picture of Ron and Diane Walker, he said quietly, "I've seen them before, but I don't know how." It took 3 days to get DNA results. They matched. Jacob Fields was Timothy Walker. 34 years after he vanished from a motel room with no signs of forced entry, he had been found. And the moment that truth landed, everything, every question, every tear, every sleepless night, took on new meaning. But the story wasn't over yet, because the next question was the one that haunted the FBI most. If he didn't run away, who took him, and why? What had he lived through between 1982 and 1988? And most of all, how did he survive? The truth, they would soon discover, was even more chilling than they could have imagined. In 2016, Grace Alvarez, a retired schoolteacher, was looking for a quieter life. She had spent 30 years teaching 3rd grade in Los Angeles, and when she finally hung up her chalkboard, she used her savings to purchase a modest farmhouse just outside Barstow, California. The property was old, charming in the way abandoned places sometimes are, and came with acres of dry land, a rickety red barn, and enough silence to feel like a fresh start. Grace had plans. A small garden, a chicken coop, and maybe even a swing under the old elm tree. But as she started settling in, she knew the barn needed attention. It had clearly been neglected for decades. The roof sagged, the doors groaned when opened, and cobwebs draped over beams like old curtains. Still, she found joy in the work. She swept out piles of dust, reorganized forgotten tools, and even discovered some vintage license plates nailed to the wall. Little glimpses of the past life the property had lived. Then, one afternoon in September, as the sun cast long shadows across the barn floor, Grace uncovered something strange. Behind a stack of broken chairs and rusted metal sheets, she noticed the corner of what looked like an old trunk. Its surface faded and partially buried beneath decades of debris. It was padlocked shut, the hinges stiff with age. Intrigued, Grace pried it open with a crowbar. What she found inside made her breath catch in her throat. Folded inside were old children's clothes. Little jeans, striped t-shirts, sneakers far too small for any grown man to have worn. Some of the clothes still had price tags on them. Others looked gently used, but clean. There were comic books too. Classic ones from the late 70s and early 80s. Superman, the Fantastic Four Archie. Near the bottom was a small, well-worn sketchpad. Grace flipped it open and gasped when she saw the inside cover. In a child's handwriting, written in blue marker, were the words, "This belongs to Timmy W." She froze. The name meant nothing to her personally, but something about it tugged at her memory. That night, she looked it up, and within minutes, her peaceful retirement shattered into something else entirely. Timmy W. wasn't just a name. He was the subject of one of California's longest unsolved child disappearance cases. Timothy Walker, 8 years old, vanished from a Bakersfield motel in 1982 without a trace. Grace sat back in her chair, stunned. The next morning, she contacted the Barstow Police Department. Within hours, the FBI was notified, and a special unit was dispatched to her property. Agents cordoned off the barn and began a full forensic sweep. The trunk and all its contents were photographed, cataloged, and taken in for testing. DNA swabs were collected from the clothing and the sketchpad. Agents combed through every inch of the barn, the surrounding land, and even beneath the floorboards. Then came the bombshell. The sketchpad, it turned out, wasn't just a doodle book. Several pages inside included journal-like entries. Sloppy handwriting, grammar mistakes, clearly written by a child, but the messages were chilling. "I miss my mom. I don't like the man with the limp. He says if I'm good, I can go outside soon." Those words changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just a discovery of old belongings. It was possible proof that Timmy Walker had not only been kidnapped, but had been alive for some time after he disappeared, that he may have been kept hidden and isolated, just 120 miles away from where the search began. More investigators were brought in. Forensic linguists examined the handwriting. Experts compared the sketchpad to school records from Timmy's second-grade class. And slowly, a timeline began to form. One entry was dated September 1984. If that was accurate, it meant Timmy had been alive at least 2 years after he was declared missing. Grace, meanwhile, watched all of this unfold with a heavy heart. She had unknowingly uncovered something buried for over 3 decades, something horrifying, tragic, but finally offering a family answers they had long stopped hoping for. Media outlets picked up the story within days. Trunk may belong to missing boy from 1982. Breakthrough in cold case. Evidence discovered in Barstow barn. Old footage of Timmy's parents resurfaced. Heartbreaking interviews from the 80s, their eyes swollen from tears, begging for any information. Now in their 70s, they were contacted by the FBI and flown to the scene. When Timmy's mother saw the sketchpad, she wept uncontrollably. "That's his writing," she said. "That's my baby." And then the DNA results came in. A sample taken from one of the t-shirts matched Timothy Walker's biological profile. The FBI officially reclassified the case from missing to abducted and presumed deceased. What came next would launch the investigation into a new, chilling direction, especially when authorities began digging deeper into the prior owners of the Barstow farmhouse. But in that moment, one truth finally surfaced. Timmy Walker had been there. He had been hidden, and for the first time in 34 years, the world knew where the trail led. A deeper search of the property revealed something far more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. At first, it looked like just another dusty barn on a remote plot of land, a forgotten relic of an older era. But investigators knew that if Timmy's sketchpad and belongings had been hidden there for decades, this property might be more than a coincidence. The local sheriff, along with FBI agents, cordoned off the entire area. Forensic teams moved in, their tools carefully combing every inch of dirt, wood, and foundation. It wasn't long before one of the investigators noticed something odd. A portion of the barn floor had a slightly different texture beneath the dust, as though it had been sealed with newer concrete. They began drilling. What they uncovered was a sealed-off cellar hidden beneath the floorboards, buried under layers of concrete, wooden beams, and old insulation. As the last slab was pulled away, a set of narrow stairs revealed itself, leading down into darkness. Flashlights pierced the musty air as investigators stepped into the hidden chamber. What they found defied logic and sent chills through even the most seasoned agents. The space was small, roughly the size of a single-room studio apartment, but it had clearly been lived in. The concrete walls were cold and damp, but decorated with an unsettling touch of humanity. Hand-drawn pictures were taped to every surface, hundreds of them. Each image showed a boy growing older over time. At age 8, then 10, then 13, then as a teenager, and even as a young man. The same face was repeated over and over, drawn in pencil and crayon. It was unmistakable. The same hair, same wide eyes, same birthmark under the left cheek. The drawings were childlike at first, but became more detailed as the subject aged, as if the artist had matured alongside the boy. A mattress rested in one corner, worn thin from years of use. Next to it sat stacks of canned food, most rusted beyond recognition, and several large jugs of stale water. There was a bookshelf filled with children's books, a few comics, and oddly medical books. The more they looked, the more the space felt like a prison built with the intent of mimicking a home. The room told a silent, haunting story of captivity. Whoever had lived there, whoever had been forced to remain underground, had tried to preserve their sense of identity. The pictures were a record, a silent, desperate way to mark the passage of time. There were tally marks on the wall near the mattress. Hundreds of them, perhaps even thousands. Forensics began swabbing the area for DNA. But it was what they found in a crawl space adjacent to the main room that brought a hush over the entire team. Behind a false wall, accessed only by removing a wooden slat nailed with crude hand tools, they found the skeletal remains. The bones were laid neatly, almost reverently. There were no signs of burial, no attempt to destroy evidence, just quiet, haunting preservation. Dental records from 1982 were pulled, and within 48 hours, the results came back. It was Timmy Walker. The discovery was both devastating and infuriating. After 34 years of mystery, speculation, and heartache, the truth had finally surfaced. But instead of closure, the evidence only raised more questions. Who had taken Timmy? Why had they kept him alive? What happened in that cellar all those years? And how had no one known about this house? About this horror? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to study the scene. Their report painted a chilling picture. The abductor had likely lived on the property at one time, but had since either died or abandoned it. There were no fingerprints on file, no usable DNA. The farmhouse had changed hands several times since 1982, but none of the past owners had ever disturbed the barn's sealed cellar. The man with the limp, the one remembered by the motel clerk, remained the only viable suspect. But his identity was still a mystery. No credit card, no vehicle plate, no registration. Just a vague description, and now a trail of horror leading to a dusty barn in Barstow. The timeline suggested that Timmy had been alive for years after his abduction. Some of the drawings had dates scrawled in the corners, indicating he may have survived well into his late teens or even early 20s. But what caused his death? There were no clear signs of violence on the bones. Toxicology was impossible given the condition of the remains. The possibility of illness, starvation, or untreated injury was discussed but inconclusive. One image in particular drew attention, a final drawing unlike the rest. It showed a grown Timmy standing beside a figure in shadows. The man was larger, hunched, almost faceless, scribbled in heavy black ink. Timmy's face was somber. The last tally mark on the wall was dated 2004. That meant Timmy had likely lived in that cellar for over 2 decades. Alone, forgotten, and drawing his life away. The FBI issued a national call for leads. Timmy's case was splashed across the headlines once more. The community rallied around his aging parents, who by then were in their 70s. They held a small candlelight vigil at the farmhouse, weeping not just for the son they lost, but for the life he endured, hidden in the shadows. This was not closure, Timmy's mother told reporters. This was torment in a different shape. But at least now, he's not alone in the dark anymore. The case remains open. The man with the limp remains unidentified. And the farmhouse, now known as the House of Echoes, has become a grim symbol of how evil can hide in plain sight. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: Timmy never stopped trying to be found. Not with screams, but with sketches. And now, finally, the world was listening. Following the discovery of Timmy Walker's remains beneath the old barn, the FBI launched one of the most meticulous reinvestigations in California history. There was a sense of national urgency to uncover not just how Timmy died, but how he had disappeared so completely in 1982 without anyone being able to stop it. It was personal now, not only for the agents who had reopened the cold case, but for the entire country. A little boy had vanished from a motel room without a trace, and for decades, no one had known the horror he endured. Digging into the past, the FBI combed through boxes of forgotten motel employment records, old logs from nearby towns, and local court archives from the early 80s. The deeper they looked, the more a single name kept surfacing across the state: Gerald Whitmore. Gerald wasn't in the original suspect pool. Back in 1982, he was just a nameless, faceless motel custodian, working odd shifts and often paid in cash. No official ID, no photo, just vague mentions by clerks and a brief note in one long-lost report that described a man with a limp seen walking behind the motel around 10 p.m. At the time, no one could tie him directly to Timmy's disappearance. But now, with new forensics, digital record matching, and decades of hindsight, Gerald Whitmore emerged as the prime suspect. He had a criminal record, though nothing particularly alarming on the surface: trespassing, vagrancy, minor theft. But it was enough to put him on the map. More disturbing was the physical description that matched the memory of the motel clerk in Bakersfield. A man with a childhood limp, who walked with a slightly tilted gait. Gerald had died back in 2003 of natural causes, living in a run-down trailer in a forgotten pocket of the California desert. There would be no trial, no chance to face justice. But agents tracked down the mobile home where he had spent his last years. They obtained a search warrant and entered the decaying space, now owned by a distant cousin who hadn't touched it in years. Inside, among piles of hoarded items and yellowed newspapers, they found something that made even hardened investigators go still: a cardboard box tucked inside the back closet. On the front, scrawled in faded marker, were the words, "Memories." Inside that box were dozens of old Polaroids. They showed Timmy, over the years. Some photos were from the early days. Timmy looking frightened, seated in a barn corner with sunlight streaking in through slats. Others showed him drawing on the walls with crayons or lying on an old mattress. A few were more haunting, blurry shots through the cracks of a door, like someone documenting him secretly. The last photos showed Timmy looking thin, weaker, older. What disturbed investigators even more was the presence of a small cassette tape recorder in the box, with a few labeled tapes. When analyzed, the audio revealed eerie snippets of a child singing softly, whispering stories to himself, and sometimes crying. The FBI confirmed what they had suspected. Gerald Whitmore had taken Timmy and kept him in isolation for what appeared to be over a decade. He had moved him from place to place, possibly even homeschooling or hiding him in rural shacks until he finally settled at the farmhouse near Barstow. Why did he keep him alive for so long? Psychologists speculated that Gerald may have developed a twisted sense of ownership over Timmy. He didn't kill him right away, likely because, in some warped part of his mind, he thought of Timmy as his companion or project. But with no medical help, no fresh food, and no social contact, Timmy's health had likely deteriorated slowly. The cause of death couldn't be determined with certainty. Too much time had passed, but forensic experts found signs of malnutrition and untreated infections in the remains. It could have been illness, or even something as simple as untreated strep throat. Gerald, not being a medical professional and living far from society, may have simply let Timmy die. What makes the tragedy even more painful is that there were moments, perhaps hundreds of them, when Timmy could have been found. Tips ignored, trails gone cold, motel records lost. Gerald blending into the background, changing towns and motels like clockwork. And Timmy? Drawing the same face on the walls of that cellar, his own face, year after year. Watching himself grow older through sketches, not mirrors. When the news was released to the public, it hit like a punch to the gut. Former FBI agents who had worked the original case cried on camera. Journalists who had covered the story in the 80s spoke with visible sorrow. And the town of Bakersfield held a candlelight vigil in Timmy's memory. People who hadn't spoken his name in 30 years now said it with reverence. Timmy Walker. Not just a headline, not just a missing poster. A boy who had lived, suffered, drawn, waited. His parents, now in their late 70s, finally got closure. They were given his belongings recovered from the cellar. The sketchbook, his favorite comic book, and a single toy car, rusted but intact. At Timmy's final memorial, his father whispered to the crowd, "He was never forgotten. He never will be." And the world learned an awful truth. Monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes, they're janitors with a limp who smile and say goodnight. And victims? They don't always get rescued in time. But they do deserve to be remembered. Always. The FBI held a press conference outside the Bureau's Los Angeles office. Cameras clicked. Reporters jostled for space. But no one was prepared for the solemnity in the air when the lead investigator approached the podium and spoke into the microphone. "This case," he said slowly, pausing between each word, "is one of the most tragic, disturbing, and haunting child abduction cases in American history. Timothy Walker's disappearance shocked the public in 1982. His rediscovery, 34 years later, has left every one of us shattered. Behind him stood a display board with Timmy's childhood photo on the left and the forensic sketch on the right, aged up to what he might have looked like in his 20s. In the middle was a single hand-drawn picture from the cellar wall, a drawing that, for decades, was never meant to be seen. A boy's attempt to leave behind a record, to show that he lived, even if he was forgotten. For Timmy's parents, now in their early 70s, The news was both a hammer blow and a strange form of mercy. For more than 3 decades, they had carried the unbearable weight of what if. What if he was alive somewhere, scared, alone? What if he was taken across the border, changed his name, lost all memory of who he was? What if he just woke up one day and walked back through their front door? Now, there would be no more what-ifs. When FBI agents arrived at the Walkers' small home in Bakersfield to inform them of the discovery, they brought more than just evidence. They brought a folded American flag, a replica of the memorial plaque, and a copy of Timmy's sketchbook, sealed in a clear archival sleeve. His mother couldn't speak. She clutched the book to her chest like it was her child. His father, once a truck driver with calloused hands and a booming laugh, simply sat down in the nearest chair and stared out the window. He whispered only one thing: he didn't forget us. A week later, a memorial ceremony was held near the old farmhouse where Timmy's remains had been discovered. The local town council approved the location without hesitation, even clearing land for a small memorial garden. The plaque was simple, but devastating in its clarity. In memory of Timothy Walker, a light lost too soon, now finally found. People came from all over California. Former classmates who hadn't seen him since first grade. Teachers who remembered him as the quiet kid who always stayed behind to tidy up the crayons. Even one retired motel clerk who'd worked the front desk the night Timmy vanished showed up, gripping the arm of his daughter as he wept into her shoulder. Grace Alvarez, the woman who had unknowingly purchased the house hiding this nightmare, also spoke at the ceremony. She said, "I bought a property to start a new chapter, and I ended up opening the last chapter of someone else's. If there's one thing I've learned through all this, it's that the past doesn't stay buried. Not forever." Journalists were present, but respectful. The nation had already seen enough of the horror. What it needed now was a reckoning. The story dominated national news for a month. Documentaries were announced. True crime podcasts traced the timeline. Online sleuths pored over old motel registry scans, trying to identify other possible victims tied to Gerald Whitmore. But there was no satisfaction, only sorrow. Gerald's death in 2003 meant there would be no trial, no courtroom, no moment where Timmy's parents could point across the aisle and scream, "Why?" There would be no justice, only evidence. But what the FBI found in Gerald's trailer gave the world something else entirely. A dark window into the broken mind of a man who stole a child's future and tried to preserve it as his own twisted legacy. Among the photographs in that trailer, some hidden in false floorboards, were dozens of Polaroids of Timmy, eating, sleeping, drawing, even smiling. A life in secret, a life in silence. The scariest part? No one heard, no one knew. For over a decade, Timmy's case was added to the national database of confirmed abductions, with a special classification assigned to victims whose remains are found after more than 30 years missing. There are only a few names on that list. Now, Timothy Walker is one of them. But for the Walker family, the story didn't end with a press conference or a plaque. They've since partnered with a nonprofit focused on missing children, speaking at events, offering their home as a safe space for families in crisis. They know the pain of not knowing, and they know the unique kind of grief that comes when you finally do. Timmy's room, untouched for decades, was turned into a reading corner at the local elementary school. It now holds shelves of books, artwork from students, and one framed drawing, Timmy's sketch of himself and a dog he'd always begged for but never got. What struck everyone most about the case wasn't just its darkness. It was the way light found its way back in. The story of Timothy Walker reminds us that silence isn't always empty. That sometimes, the most profound truths hide in the quietest corners. And that even when time moves on, it never truly forgets. Because somewhere in the heart of a sealed cellar, a boy kept drawing, kept hoping, kept waiting, And after 34 years, the world finally heard him,